So, a Serbian tabloid invited a serial rapist for an interview. Yes, you heard that right. The man came into the offices of the tabloid newspaper Informer and matter-of-factly retold the tales of his troubled childhood and experiences of raping women. Here's some of the most shocking statements he nonchalantly made live on camera. And I quote, "I have raped for the first time when I was 10 years old. Ever since my 14th birthday, I've spent only some 3 months outside of prison. While I was raping and stealing, I felt freedom. The fear in those women and my freedom and excitement that I can do with them whatever I want to, that is why I raped. Remorse comes later. In prison, I asked for a sex doll, but they didn't give me one for security reasons. If I wish to rape you, I will do it. If you want me to kill you, then you just tell me and I will kill you." Being only one of thousands of such exclusive articles that touch on sensitive, provocative, and morbid topics for the sake of clickbaiting people into pages with dozens of cash-generating ads, this one isn't as off the rails as one would expect. In the pile of rubbish and cancer of such clickbaity articles and yellow journalism, you would be surprised with the nastiness you could find. Nastiness that has desensitized its consumers to all forms of unfiltered violence, promiscuity, and shamelessness that have become commonplace in our society of the spectacle. I'm sure most people watching this are well aware of the profiteering character of this kind of gossip journalism. It's a profit-making machinery that invents, scandalizes, exaggerates, and skews information for the sake of grabbing your attention with a spectacular title and dragging you down the depths of the reality TV and black chronicle rabbit hole, all the while stealing your data and bombarding you with ads. All things considered, a relatively commonplace business model that seems to innocently generate vast amounts of wealth based on lies, gossip, and slander, while stealing your attention and occasionally insulting your intelligence. So nothing directly harmful to the reader or the people involved. Yet this particular story was different. It stood out. It stood out because it touched the nerve of the societal collective in a way many others didn't. It stood out because of the psychopathic and passive-aggressive character of the interviewed serial rapist, for his audacity to not only proudly talk about his crimes, but also to threaten the female journalists in the room live on camera. It stood out because of the decades and centuries of accumulated frustration and anger on the side of innocent women and girls who've endured enough violence, verbal and physical abuse, degradation and humiliation by the male world that ended up monetizing their suffering in the form of such exclusive news. And boy, did this thing cause a reaction. The mass protests in the capital city of Belgrade and the broad movement that sprung out of this scandal have largely managed to articulate the grievances and concerns of a huge amount of women, not only in Serbia but also in the Balkan Peninsula, that share the same trauma, objectification, commodification, and violence in a similar capacity, and the rest of the world to varying degrees. As a result, the maniac got arrested for, among other things, telling Informer's female journalists that he can rape them and kill them if he so wishes. In typical opportunist fashion, the tabloid now claims his incarceration as a personal victory of its supposedly planned initiative to provoke the wrath of the public for the sake of putting him behind bars. But this transparent opportunism didn't fool anyone as protests continued on the streets and in front of Informer's offices. Now, cynical anti-SJW and anti-feminist types would at this point dismissively wave this off and try to isolate this case as something perhaps abhorrent and crazy, yet by no means commonplace or relevant for most people. "It's not all men" is the mantra that you can hear more than enough. She was probably asking for it, or she consciously put herself in danger. She shouldn't have gotten drunk. She wasn't careful enough, and so on and so on. Well, dear gentlemen, since I've heard more than enough paroles about how we need real men and how there's a war on masculinity, how about we take a moment to have a little chat, man to man, shall we? So where do we start? Perhaps responsibility would be the buzzword of the day. as we can already hear it echoing off the thick walls of the manosphere that seems to have a cult-like obsession with the apparently masculine trait of personal responsibility. So I ask you then, who is responsible for this? One may be tempted to casually proclaim that this is the monster's personal responsibility, that we should throw him in jail and call it a day. But that's not enough. The heinous crimes of a certain layer of society, comprised mostly of outcasts who've been banished and forgotten by our fast-paced modern world, are a collective societal concern. Yet once again, if we accept this premise, it may be then tempting to assume that mitigating the issues of pauperism, homelessness, and mentally ill people walking down our streets would be the solution. Unsafe streets seem like the natural habitat of such predators. However, surprisingly enough, this kind of approach would be missing the target audience almost entirely. Herein lies a crucial assumption that is incredibly dangerous and, above all, irresponsible. Namely, that such appalling acts of sexual violence against women are merely isolated occurrences of psychotic men randomly startling women in dark alleyways and taking advantage of them for their sick pleasure, because, not all men are rapists. This, my friend, couldn't be farther from the truth. Surely, most men would never consider raping someone, as it's rightfully seen as a despicable crime. I mean, consider your close friends. You'd never think any of them would ever be able to be that monstrous, now would you? You see them as these honest, hard-working people, or childhood friends, whose innocence blinds your male brain from registering them as potential offenders. I know this because it took me a while before I managed to see through this thick fog that was clouding my judgment, because I always went from the assumption that I would never do such a thing, personally. Neither would my friends, since I know them so well. So who the hell are these predators if not the mentally ill, psychopathic, and narcissistic types? Surely only people who fit the description of this monster and others like him. Surely nobody from my near vicinity. Right? Well, with this kind of outlook, it then becomes easy to assign all the blame to women for not being careful enough, for not dressing appropriately, for going through the wrong neighborhood, for going out with questionable men, for drinking irresponsibly, and so on. Simultaneously, however, we tend to scrutinize those same young women for being too wary, too paranoid and defensive around us normal men, assuring them how it's not all men and how we, the normal ones, shouldn't be under constant suspicion because of a small percentage of men whose actions we also formally denounce. It's a flood of contradictions pouring out of hot-headed men like you and me, who want to guard themselves from blame and responsibility, point a finger at a certain persona, and personally be rid of all suspicion. Having defined this certain specific section of the male population as the ones responsible for a large majority of such heinous acts, having constructed this narrow persona that seems to have nothing in common with the average Joe, we subconsciously do exactly that. We escape the blame game and leave our fellow women in the dark. Since we're all fond of some good old male responsibility, how about we consider this whole conundrum a bit more lucidly and stop fleeing the scene of a recurring crime that we, yes we, collectively have the ability and responsibility to solve. And I think I have just the right means of showing you how and why. Now consider this spine-chilling fact. The vast majority of rapes are conducted by close friends and family, not some lunatic on the street, not because a woman was whoring around and asking for it, not because she wasn't careful enough, by friends and family. Let that sink in. If you're having trouble with conceptualizing this fact, let me help you by showing a few images of the clothes that women have worn at the times they got sexually assaulted. If the trigger for sexual harassment and assault is the way a woman behaves or dresses, then why do Muslim women wearing burqas get raped? Why would little children aged 5, 10, and 15 get raped? Is it because they behaved and dressed inappropriately? Were they asking for it? Huh? Does any of this correlate with the apparent irresponsible whoring around, carelessly drinking and taking unnecessary risks? For me, this indicates a very disturbing fact. The monsters are not entirely the obvious ones we are always so quick to use as a scapegoat. They are among us, disguised as your friend Mike or Uncle Jim, as the unsuspecting, hard-working fellow who doesn't seem like he would harm an insect. There are countless terrifying tales of elementary and middle school teachers, of dance instructors and mentors, blackmailing children and young girls to surrender their body in exchange for grades and a potential career. There are tales of bosses demanding sex in exchange for a promotion, then having society blame and slut-shame women for having slept their way to the top. The trope of Catholic priests and uncles being child molesters has become so destigmatized and quite frankly normalized on the internet, to the extent that some see it as a funny meme they'll laugh at for a second and then forget, whereas millions of genuine victims are left scarred for life and are unable to ever again forge another trustworthy, healthy sexual relationship. There are tens of thousands of well-known cases of sexual abuse of children by Catholic priests, nuns, and popes, with many allegations, investigations, convictions, and revelations over the past few centuries, putting a notorious label onto the Catholic Church as a lair of pedophiles and molesters of children, boys and girls, as young as 3 years old, majority of whom are between 11 and 14 years old. Moreover, in a famous Belgrade musical school in Serbia, director Miroslav Aleksić had been raping and sexually harassing underage girls for years on end, ending in a shocking wave of victims coming out with horrid stories of their traumatic experiences as his students. In May 2020 in New Orleans, 55-year-old Rodney Vicknair, in his capacity as a police officer, transported an unnamed 14-year-old girl to the hospital to receive an examination following a rape. Vicknair used this incident to groom the girl for months, only to later rape the girl himself at least 2 times. Now tell me, who the fuck can women exactly trust if not their fellow spiritual leaders, teachers, police officers, family members? And who are you to demand their unequivocal trust in your good intentions with all these horrid realities that surround us? All of that default male innocence may seem valid, up until that fateful moment when they sense an unsuspecting innocent child or woman that they can take advantage of in exchange for favors or pure sadistic exploitation. Up until no starts sounding like a yes, when their animalistic desire to inflict pain takes over and the woman before them is a means to an end, when she becomes an object of his fantasies. Disturbingly enough, rape is in most cases not about the sexual satisfaction of the act itself, but about sadistically inflicting pain onto the victim, about seeing them suffer and go through trauma. This reality is echoed by the monster from the beginning of the video himself, who said, quote, "The fear in those women and my freedom and excitement that I can do with them whatever I want to." Testimonies from other serial rapists like him confirm this abhorrent reality. The true predators, the vast majority of them in fact, do not conduct their deeds in fits of random rage in darkened alleyways. They are forged in your average family homes through a toxic cocktail of violent pornography, sexual frustration, a disregard and disrespect of women, and the arrogance of casually catcalling and groping girls at a young age. A cocktail that finds its origins in adolescence, when boundaries are rarely set by parents, teachers, and the society. Boys will be boys is the usual reaction to typical male behavior that, although normalized and apparently innocent in the eyes of most men, leaves incredible trauma and shame on girls that are on the receiving end of such abhorrent behavior. Growing up and discovering the advantages of their superiority in physical strength, they become even more arrogant in the imposition of their will onto unsuspecting girls. They begin to evaluate, stalk, and assault their prey in your everyday mundane settings, not only in drug-infested parties and casinos. Once again, you personally may not have it in you to do such a despicable act, but the point is that you can never ever vouch for anyone else, let alone the majority of your gender. This isn't about your personal image and ego as a good and honest Christian, or about the honor of your group of childhood buddies and fellow men, but about recognizing that predators are much closer, much more mundane and unexpected, despite their deceitful vibe or status in society. Their very societal status is, paradoxically, often additional fuel in their self-serving, narcissistic behavior, as men of higher status, such as celebrities, tend to think that they can do whatever the hell they want because they're someone and because they're generally desirable.
Svaki muškarac ženu gleda kao seksualni objekat, prvenstveno. Tako da ako naletiš na neku budalu koja je u tom trenutku pijana, drogirana, a ti ideš takva ulicom sama, znači ti si isto kriva. Drugo je krivično delo kad ti dođeš kod nekog kući u 12 uveče i onda kažeš da te zlostavljao, ti si došla sama od sebe tamo. Znači to nije baš toliko krivično delo, jer si znala zašto si došla tu.
Jer tebi čak i tvoja devojka možda kaže ne u nekom trenutku i to treba da se poštuje.
Nema tu ne, gledaj ovako.
Kako nema ne?
Slušaj ovako, šalješ gole slike muškarcu. Se naći u toj situaciji uživo sa muškarcem koji je pijan, doći ćeš kod njega kući i nemoj to da pričaš što si sad meni rekla. Pošto možda neko možda ti izbaci ovako kroz prozor. Znači to sve što pričaš ti to zadrži za sebe ako si pametna. Ti misliš da si pametna ako si takva, nisi. Ti treba muškarcu kažeš jeste, sve si ti upravo. I on kaže, znaš...
Ja se izvinjavam.
To treba da uradiš, tako. Ja se izvinjavam, izađe napolje i niko neće te dirati.
Now, in case you're having trouble digesting all of this, I think it would be useful to define what we consider as rape and sexual harassment, and consequently see the number of potential offenders grow exponentially. Rape, or sexual assault, is not necessarily a rigid, strictly defined act of unprecedented violence. More often than not, it is a simple question of consent. It is a question of understanding that no means no, of understanding that a woman has every right to seduce you, turn you on, and decide not to have sex with you. It's a question of understanding that even during intercourse, a woman has every right to ask you to stop. Even if it is a case of intentional provocation, of leading on and toying with you, none of this gives you the right to continue without her consent. Furthermore, sexual harassment may include unwanted, sexually suggestive behavior like catcalling, sexual jokes and comments, touching and groping, all of which are directed at women and girls on an everyday basis, all of which make all women uncomfortable, period. Regardless of wealth, status, or reputation of the source, there is not a single woman that enjoys being catcalled through the window of a slowly driving car, that enjoys being the subject of a tasteless sexual joke or anything similar. None of that is a compliment. None of it. Ultimately, all of this talk is about not allowing your animalistic impulses overtake your judgment, and instead seeing the woman you're walking behind, talking to, or sleeping with as a sentient human being that has every right to start feeling uncomfortable and ask you to stop. It is about establishing some basic human decency, above and beyond legal consequences that are already meager and meaningless as most sex offenders go unpunished in this patriarchal system made by the very population of likely offenders. What is considered rape or sexual harassment indeed is a spectrum with different severities. And guess what? A woman can indeed realize that she had been raped even after the fact. It's not always that simple for the victim to admit to themselves what happened, to rethink the situation and come to terms with the fact that they indeed got raped. I can bet my ass that there's a certain number of men watching this right now that briefly went, I did do that a couple of times, so by your definition that means I'm a rapist. No sir, you are a rapist. It's not my definition or wish to accuse you. It's a case of basic human decency and listening to women about what makes them uncomfortable and what crosses the damn line. Yes, it is very likely that you've actually committed an offense without ever realizing it, because the victim is likely to be way too afraid of you or the societal consequences to dare and come out with their story. Thus, those who aspire to be these misogynistic alpha male studs should consider that acting upon primitive, animalistic impulses and justifying your actions with uncontrollable desires does not make you a superior man whatsoever. It makes you exactly that, primitive. Unsurprisingly, there is this prevalent outcry how most rape allegations are manipulative lies with the goal of destroying a man's career and reputation, as some sort of feminist plot to destroy men's lives, while enjoying the label of being a woman that had been raped. Whereas there may be a certain percentage of such cases where women intentionally set up a man for time in jail, it is statistically insignificant compared to the amount of sexual assault that goes unreported and unpunished. 1 in 5 women have experienced some kind of sexual assault during their lives at least once. 1 in 5. A comparatively small amount of offenders answer for their crimes, of which a majority go unreported. It doesn't take much brainpower to see that false allegations are laughable in comparison. For every falsely accused man with a ruined career, there are thousands of silently traumatized women who are often scarred for life, both physically and psychologically. Women who will never come out with their story due to the usual societal shaming and degradation of such women, that are then often condemned as dirty and impure, as if the assault was their fault. If the victim stays silent or comes out after a few years, then why didn't she report? What took her so long? When she reports, she's accused of looking for fame. She is shamed by law enforcement and judges for having worn certain clothing, for having been at a certain place, always accused of not being careful enough, whereas offenders often either get away with it entirely or serve meager sentences. Why didn't she defend herself? Well, if you only knew the amount of paranoid precautions, variables, and defense techniques and tools the average woman has to consider in the most mundane everyday situations, you would be shocked. If you were to see the scratch marks on certain offenders that continued to rape, despite the victim's ferocious response, I think my words would be superfluous. Okay, but how come she chose this convenient moment to ruin this man's career? Well, my friend, all things considered, they shouldn't have had a career in the first place. All of these public figures you see on the screen have a well-known background in sexual harassment and assault. Yet instead of being behind bars, we see them buy their way out while continuing their vibrant careers, their crimes slowly withering away from the public consciousness.
You got a smile that lights up the whole Senate chamber.
I'll tell you what, you've got very good taste, like your father.
Come on, sis, you get right in the middle with me. You get right over here, over this. Mom, you get right in the middle. Come on, Dad. Okay, is this your sister? You have a hard job. You got to keep the boys away from your sister. That's the deal. Hey, Jasper, you're going to have a hard job keeping the boys away from your sister. What are you, a senior? I like kids better than people. Come on, this can hurt your reputation, man. You're going to have to go home and explain. What would I do with her, okay? You ready? Now, you getting in this picture? Right next to me. There you go. Okay. Grandpa's one of the good guys.
That's nice.
No, I'm not saying it. He knows I'm here. One important girl. Take care of the pop.
Despite the deserving onslaught of spooky, scary cancel culture, thousands of rapists and sex offenders walk freely and continue to saturate our media and govern our societies as if nothing happened. Not only have we become desensitized to such crimes being something common and mundane, but we even dare to defend these people on the basis of their success or cult of personality. Bluntly speaking, to focus on the male side of the story is dishonest and pathetic. As I used to use such empty platitudes myself, while trying to defend the honor of my gender, I guess, I can promise you that the cognitive dissonance of being an impulsive male apologist is, from this perspective, one of the more shameful episodes in my development as a person. With the increasing number of female public figures confessing their troubled past of being a victim of sexual violence in the light of the Me Too movement, there's a disgustingly cynical reaction of some men who dismiss these brave acts as seeking fame and wanting to be trendy. If we've learned anything from during this video, it should be obvious why such appalling cynicism is unforgivable. Nobody wants to be fucking popular for being raped, alright man? There's nothing fun about it. It's not something to be carried lightly or proudly. It is a traumatic episode for every single victim, and openly talking about it is no simple task. PTSD and other mental disorders are common occurrences of rape victims, yet somehow we manage to glorify those acquired by war veterans that voluntarily went to genocide brown people, yet we dismiss it in the case of innocent women that ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. What a world we live in. Nonetheless, increasing reports and the number of victims coming out are not symptoms of an ever more arrogant feminist populace that conspires to destroy the male world, but are a reflection of a safer, more inclusive environment that resorts less and less to punishing and shaming victims, which is purely the result of centuries of struggle. Oh, but men get raped too. Absolutely. Yet the ratio and probability of such a thing happening is so absurdly low compared to female victims that using such a catchphrase is cynical and evil at its very core. It's the equivalent of insisting how white lives matter too. Yes, they do, yet the political and economic foundations of our society have developed in such a way to give one group unfair political, monetary, and physical advantages over the other. Advantages that are institutionalized and systemic, that make the power relations between whites and blacks, between capitalists and workers, and ultimately between men and women, wholly integrated into the fabric of society, in such a way that permits very little variation. The antagonistic relationship between man and woman is equivalent to a worker yelling at his boss, and a boss yelling at his worker. Sure, both may be rude and unfriendly acts, yet only one of them has the institutional and systemic ability to make the interaction go entirely in their favor. Some men may get raped and harassed by women, yet most of them have the physical ability to defend themselves. This does not hold true the other way around. Yet, despite this troubled and disturbing reality for millions of women, this does not stop newspapers and media outlets like Informer from monetizing their trauma and creating a spectacle, or as they would call it, a mega exclusive. This kind of behavior predictably draws its roots from the profit motive of the prevailing capitalist organization of the economy. In the light of lucrative and exclusive gossip, you can forget about ethical and moral guidelines. Anything that draws attention and clicks will be published. The societal consequences be damned. No amount of liberal moralizing and philosophizing will change this reality. The profit motive, itself an offspring of capitalist market economies, is the main culprit in such embarrassing episodes of irresponsible reporting and monetization of someone's trauma. Only the abolition of this motive and its very foundations can guarantee a healthier public media environment that seeks to heal and remedy injustices instead of using them as a means of getting rich. So, comrades, the question of responsibility for this unfortunate phenomenon should, drawing our conclusions from the preceding analysis, be crystal clear to everybody. Liberal and reactionary notions of personal responsibility are, as in all other cases, not only useless for systematically solving this problem, but are actively harmful for all those women that are left in the dark by our selfish, ignorant, and cynical selves. The solution is not to militarize women, to tell them to be more careful and responsible, while accepting that boys will be boys and that's how the world works, while allowing every man to be the conjurer of his own personal moral code, only personally responsible for his actions. No, we have a collective responsibility, both as men, women, and everything in between, to address these issues vocally, to bravely stand in the way of those who arrogantly think that someone else's body is an expendable object of their fantasies. Not because that victim could be your mother, daughter, or sister, but because she is a human being just like you. This commonly used analogy should not be allowed to paint the picture that a woman should be valued, respected, and cared for only if she's a family member of yours. If we are to think of long-term solutions, then young girls should be taught that they do not owe anyone a hug, a kiss, let alone anything else, while young boys must be taught about consent and boundaries at an age where this is still possible. None of this is a private matter of the nuclear family, but a collective societal matter that must be addressed in educational institutions strictly and thoroughly. Ultimately, women ought to continue supporting each other as they already do, and marching as fearlessly as they have in the previous century, watching the pillars of the ossified patriarchy crumble behind them, until they're treated as truly equal members of society. And we gentlemen have only one job, and that is to call out and stand in the way of those misogynistic bastards who think they can do whatever they want, to break the vicious circle of silence and cowardice of the male world in the light of these countless atrocities, and to finally understand that ignorantly sweeping our sins under the rug for the sake of saving our collective trustworthiness, reputation, and pride is nothing but pathetic. If you truly care about the reputation of the male world, how about we start re-educating and purging its numerous problematic elements instead of pretending that nothing is wrong?